Were there changes to the law of Moses within the Torah itself? In Western culture today, one of the notions of divine law that folks have is that it cannot be changed. But the ancients had quite different views of law, including the authors of the Bible, as we'll see in this lesson. Modern Western views of inspiration tend to think of each book of the Bible as written by one individual, and not modified later, especially the books of the laws of Moses, especially not added on to in response to various situations arising, which is the way man-made law tends to develop. However, there are multiple examples of exactly that scenario throughout Scripture. In fact, there are multiple examples of this in the Torah's own chronology of the giving of the law. For example, there is a law that property be passed through firstborn male heirs. This was much more important than we today might realize, because laws of inheritance were supposed to keep the territories of Israel within a particular tribe, and within a particular family as well. There was even a prohibition on the sale of property outside of a tribe for more than 49 years. Failure to adhere to these rules was supposed to result in the loss of Yahweh's blessings, such as food and security from enemies. The Torah stated over and over the importance of such laws. Of course, as we'll see in later lessons, those tribal territories were never fully conquered as envisioned in the Torah or in the book of Joshua, where such failures are in fact alluded to in places, especially in Judges. And it was not much more than a generation later when those territories began to be irreparably lost, according to the Bible's own accounts, such as in Judges 18. Sure, Israel would occasionally regain large sections of territory in the biblical narrative, but the original partitioning of the land to the 12 tribes, a hope never fully realized, would remain entropic throughout the history of Israel until only two kingdoms would be named for their dominant tribe, Ephraim for Israel and Judah for the southern kingdom, from around 530 to 722 BC. Then finally, the remnant of Israel's heritage would be called Jews from about the 6th century BC onward, after the territory of Judah. True, by the time of Christ, they would still refer to various regions by their tribal names based on ancient texts, but in practice, there were regions based on actual divisions of the peoples, named mostly by foreign rulers, with Jewish Judea in the south, the mixed Samaritans north from there, then regions such as Galilee in the north, which was predominantly Gentile. Judea itself contained peoples from all the tribes from at least the time of the Assyrian conquest of Israel, when there was probably a massive influx of refugees fleeing south, many of whom would eventually be unable to trace their lineage, which was so important under Mosaic Law, especially by the time of the return from Babylonian captivity, when only a remnant of a remnant would return. But I digress. When the children of Israel, guided by Moses, approached the Promised Land after 4 decades of wandering in the wilderness, one man was found to have only daughters. 5, in fact. In Numbers 27, these 5 daughters present their case to Moses and request that they receive a portion of land along with their father's brothers, and that his name be carried down through them, not their future husbands. This is a most curious case for the ancient world. Firstly, although historians have speculated that Israel's tribal roots were much more egalitarian than other nations, it would seem a rare thing for 5 women to plead any case in the ancient world. Secondly, at first glance, it seems an odd thing for these women to ask that Moses go against the letter of the law, though their request appears to be consistent with the spirit of the law, which of course is confirmed by Yahweh. It should also be noted that not only does their request precipitate an addendum to the law that female lineage is to be used where there is no male, yet another detail is added to the law in order to also uphold the intent of the original law. Such women can only marry within their tribe. As we'll consider below, addendums to Yahweh's law are often found in totally separate books, as is the case with this incident in Numbers, with the actual law found in Leviticus. But the law is referenced again in Numbers 26, and with the addendums in Numbers 36. There are often interesting examples of rules seeming to arise as the result of situations not given all at the beginning with total foresight. For instance, in Numbers 9, there were men who had touched a dead body, probably to bury it, and were therefore ceremoniously unclean and unable to partake of the obligatory Passover. So Moses consulted God, who added a rule that there would be a make-up Passover for anyone who was unclean or on a journey during the regularly appointed time of Passover. Another interesting addition to at least the way that Moses did things came from his father-in-law, Jethro, who suggested that he appoint judges to assist him in judging the people, because Moses was overburdened with the task. A fundamentalist might argue that this was not the establishment of a law, but my guess is that many ancients would have in fact seen it as a precedent that established the legitimacy of Levitical judges, which was certainly established elsewhere. Interestingly, contrary to the later rule of appointing Levites as judges, it says specifically that Moses chose judges from the people. Another modern fundamentalist argument might be that Jethro was a priest of Yahweh and therefore spoke by inspiration. Maybe. But this does not change the fact that this would still be a case of Yahweh giving law in response to a situation arising. Why wasn't Moses told when he was first given law that he could or should appoint judges? There are surely very many religious people who have absolutely no problem with the idea that God could have given revelation in response to situations arising. One might even argue that these examples were actually given to help people learn how to apply God's law as various situations arose. My main point, regardless of how anyone explains why or how such things could be, is that the law was not given all at once and was in fact modified as situations arose. If you wanted even more ways in which an omniscient God could have given law piecemeal, it might help to compare it to our own modern laws. Note that with secular laws, the so-called English common law tradition recognizes the need for application of legal principles, and not just a wooden adherence to a code that tries to provide for every circumstance. It is at least in some ways unfortunate that the common law today has largely been superseded by growing codifications, to a level that the Romans probably did not reach. The United States Code alone would fill an entire bookshelf and is still only a fraction of all of the laws, rules, regulations, etc. that apply to its citizens. It is similarly interesting to note that the Torah's laws often appear illustrative, like common law, and not all-encompassing, as our modern law is required to be. The requirement to help your fellow lift a fallen donkey or ox was a principle-based law. Most ancient people would surely have no problem applying it to other animals, rightly believing that this was the intent of the author. This is a far cry from our modern codes, which must contain the exact description in every element of a crime. In fact, modern law has become so codified that it has lost some of its spirit and even perpetuates injustice that it was intended to prevent. It should also be noted that the Torah was quite different from modern law in many other ways. For instance, in the case of the various requirements to help your neighbor, we see the intent to promote love of one's fellow with no judicial penalty listed if you don't do so. You will search long for equivalent moralizing in modern law, much less the command to ensure that you teach such good morals to your children all day, every day. Torah actually meant instruction, before the Septuagint called it nomos, the Greek word for law. In fact, modern ideas regarding the nature of law and how it is more lettered code than guiding principle have surely colored many fundamentalist interpretations of Scripture and theories as to how it must have been inspired, in ways that never would have occurred to the ancients. It should therefore not be surprising to find some instances in the Bible of people getting some practice applying the divine law in real-world situations, even with God's approval of their application in some cases, such as with the 5 daughters of Zelophehad. However, I am not arguing that that's what happened, just that we should not be bound to ideas of inspiration or law contradicted by the Bible itself, much less influenced by our own time, as far as we can help it. What might be more difficult for the fundamentalist is the fact that many of these addendums actually altered the law as if there was not perfect forethought in their original construction. And now we turn to yet more differences in Scripture that are even more problematic for a once-and-done drop-from-the-sky theory of inspiration. There are many other types of what could be called addendums or even rewrites of some laws in the Bible, some of which are covered in more depth throughout my book, since they are key to understanding how and why we got the Bible that we have. In the next lesson, we'll see how the laws of the Torah were altered by biblical books outside the Torah, even as those books revered the Torah.